The morning of June 6, 1944, somewhere over the hedgerow country of Normandy, a young Luftwaffe pilot named Feldwebel Hans Dortenmann pushed his Focke-Wulf 190 into a shallow dive. He had been flying combat missions for nearly 2 years by then, and he knew the skies over France the way a farmer knows his fields. He had seen Spitfires. He had tangled with Mustangs. He had learned to respect the Lightning's twin engines and the way it could climb. But on this particular morning, as he scanned the horizon for the American fighter bombers that had been savaging German supply columns, he spotted something different. It was thick. It was heavy. It looked, frankly, like a milk jug with wings. The Germans had a name for it. They called it the Jug, a mocking translation of the American nickname that the Republic Aviation Company had given its own creation. To Luftwaffe pilots, the P-47 Thunderbolt looked laughably fat compared to their sleek, angular fighters. It was the largest single-engine fighter of the entire war, weighing nearly 8 tons fully loaded. Its fuselage was so wide that early models required a specially designed bubble canopy just so pilots could see past the massive radial engine in front of them. German intelligence reports dismissed it as a brummer, a buzzing, lumbering thing. Surely, they reasoned, something that heavy could never compete with the nimble Focke-Wulf or the legendary Messerschmitt 109. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This assumption would prove to be one of the costliest miscalculations of the air war over Europe, because the P-47 Thunderbolt was not designed to be nimble. It was designed to be something far more terrifying. It was designed to be indestructible. And it was designed to carry 8 M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns that could turn an enemy aircraft into shredded aluminum at 400 yards. To understand how the Thunderbolt earned its fearsome reputation, we must first understand the problem it was built to solve. In 1940 and 1941, as the Battle of Britain raged and America watched from across the Atlantic, military planners in Washington faced a troubling reality. American fighter aircraft were, by the brutal standards of modern air combat, inadequate. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk was rugged and reliable, but it could not compete with the Messerschmitt 109 at high altitude. The Bell P-39 Airacobra had an ingenious design with its engine mounted behind the pilot, but it struggled above 15,000 feet and was eventually shipped in large numbers to the Soviet Union, where it found better use in low-altitude ground attack. The United States Army Air Forces needed a new fighter, one that could escort heavy bombers deep into German territory and fight on equal terms with the best the Luftwaffe could offer. Enter Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer who had fled the Russian Revolution and found his way to the Republic Aviation Corporation on Long Island. Kartveli was not a man who thought small. When the Army Air Corps issued a requirement for a lightweight interceptor in 1940, Kartveli initially envisioned a small, agile aircraft. But as the specifications evolved, more armor, more guns, more fuel, a more powerful engine, the design grew and grew. What emerged from Kartveli's drafting table was not a lightweight interceptor at all. It was a 7-ton monster built around the most powerful piston engine ever fitted to a fighter aircraft, the Pratt & Whitney R2000, 800 double wasp. The R2800 was an 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial engine that produced over 2,000 horsepower in its wartime variants. It was the same engine that would power the Corsair, the Hellcat, and the B-26 Marauder. But in the Thunderbolt, Kartveli did something unprecedented. He fitted the aircraft with a turbo supercharger system that allowed the engine to maintain its power at extreme altitudes. The supercharger was fed by exhaust gases ducted through a series of pipes that ran beneath the pilot's seat and along the belly of the aircraft, which accounted for much of the Thunderbolt's distinctive girth. At 30,000 feet, where the thin air starved conventional engines, the P-47 could still produce nearly full power. This made it one of the few American fighters capable of meeting the Luftwaffe on equal terms in the high-altitude battles over Germany. But altitude performance was only part of the equation. The Thunderbolt's true signature was its armament. 8 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, with a total ammunition capacity of over 3,000 rounds. The M2 Browning was not a sophisticated weapon. It had been designed by John Moses Browning in 1918, near the end of the First World War, and it had changed little in the intervening decades. But what it lacked in elegance, it made up for in sheer destructive power. Each gun fired at a rate of approximately 800 rounds per minute. A 1-second burst from all 8 guns sent nearly 107 rounds downrange, a combined weight of metal exceeding 60 pounds. The bullets themselves were half an inch in diameter and capable of penetrating armor, igniting fuel tanks, and shattering engine blocks. American fighter doctrine at the time favored the 50-caliber machine gun over the cannons used by European air forces. The British Spitfire carried 2 20mm Hispano cannons and 4 rifle-caliber machine guns. The German Focke-Wulf 190 carried a mix of 20mm cannons and smaller machine guns, with some variants mounting 30mm weapons for bomber interception. On paper, cannons offered greater hitting power per round. A single 20mm shell could do what might take a dozen 50-caliber bullets to achieve. But the American philosophy was different. The 50-caliber Browning offered a higher rate of fire, a flatter trajectory, and vastly more ammunition. A Thunderbolt pilot could hold his trigger down for over 20 seconds of continuous fire, an eternity in aerial combat. And when 8 streams of half-inch bullets converged on a target at 400 yards, the effect was not surgical. It was catastrophic. German pilots discovered this the hard way. The Luftwaffe's standard fighter tactics in 1943 and 1944 relied on speed, altitude, and hit-and-run attacks. The Focke-Wulf 190, with its powerful BMW radial engine and excellent roll rate, was superb in the dive and zoom engagements that characterized high-altitude combat over the Reich. German pilots would climb above the American bomber formations, select a target, dive through at high speed, fire a quick burst, and then use their momentum to escape before the escort fighters could respond. Against the earlier P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs, this tactic could be effective if executed with precision. But the Thunderbolt changed the calculation. Its massive engine and robust airframe gave it a dive speed that few aircraft could match. In a vertical plunge, the P-47 could exceed 500 miles per hour faster than most German fighters and far faster than any bomber. German pilots who attempted to escape a Thunderbolt by diving away often found, to their horror, that the American fighter followed them down, its 8 guns blazing. The Jug that had looked so ponderous on the ground became a falling hammer in the sky. And there was another factor that German pilots had not anticipated: the Thunderbolt's astonishing durability. The aircraft was built like a battleship. Its radial engine, unlike the liquid-cooled inline engines of the Mustang or the Messerschmitt, had no vulnerable coolant system to rupture. A 50-caliber round through the cylinder head of an R2800 might destroy that cylinder, but the engine would keep running on the remaining 17. Thunderbolt pilots returned to base with entire cylinders shot away, with control surfaces shredded, with holes in their wings large enough to put a fist through. There are documented cases of P-47 seconds taking over 100 hits from German fighters and flak and still making it home. One such incident involved Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, one of the leading American aces in the European theater. In June of 1943, during a mission over France, Johnson's Thunderbolt was hit by a Focke-Wulf 190 in a head-on pass. The German's cannon shells shattered his canopy, wounded him in the face and shoulder, and disabled his aircraft systems. His cockpit filled with smoke, his engine was failing. He was convinced he was about to die. Then, remarkably, the German pilot, later identified as Egon Meyer, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces, pulled alongside him. Meyer had expended his ammunition trying to finish Johnson off. For several long moments, the two pilots flew in formation, the German apparently unable to believe that the Thunderbolt was still airborne. Meyer eventually peeled away, and Johnson, half-blind and bleeding, nursed his shattered aircraft back across the English Channel. He landed at Manston, and when the ground crew counted the holes, they found over 200. This was the aircraft that Feldwebel Dortenmann and his comrades faced over Normandy in the summer of 1944. By then, the Thunderbolt had evolved from a high-altitude escort fighter into something even more dangerous, a ground attack aircraft of devastating effectiveness. The same characteristics that made it a formidable dogfighter, speed in the dive, heavy armament, near indestructibility, made it ideal for strafing German columns, destroying locomotives, and turning tanks into burning coffins. The P-47 could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, or 10 5-inch rockets, in addition to its 8 machine guns. Fighter bomber groups like the 56th, the 78th, and the 353rd became the terror of the German army in France. They attacked anything that moved: trucks, staff cars, horse-drawn artillery, fuel depots, radar stations. The Luftwaffe called these attacks Jabot raids, short for Jagdbomber, or fighter bomber, and they learned to dread the distinctive silhouette of the Thunderbolt diving out of the clouds. The psychological impact was immense. German soldiers in Normandy quickly learned that daylight movement was suicidal. Convoys travelled only at night, tanks were hidden beneath trees and camouflage netting. Officers abandoned their staff cars and took to bicycles and motorcycles. Even then, they were not safe. The P-47 seconds hunted in packs, circling over roads and rail lines, waiting for any sign of movement. A single glint of sunlight off a windshield could bring 850 calibers screaming down. German veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had fought through Stalingrad and Kursk, later recalled that nothing they experienced in Russia compared to the terror of American fighter bombers in France. And yet, for all the Thunderbolt's effectiveness, the Luftwaffe kept fighting. By mid-1944, the German Air Force was a shadow of its former self, bled white by attrition, starved of fuel by the Allied bombing campaign against synthetic oil plants, and increasingly filled with hastily trained replacements who lacked the skills of the pre-war veterans. But the pilots who remained were often exceptionally skilled, and they knew their aircraft intimately. The Focke-Wulf 190D9, known as the Dora, was one of the finest piston-engine fighters ever built. It was faster than the standard Thunderbolt at most altitudes, and in the hands of an experienced pilot, it could be deadly. The Messerschmitt 109, G and K models, though showing their age, were still dangerous opponents. German pilots learned to exploit the Thunderbolt's weaknesses: its relatively poor climb rate, its wide turning radius, its tendency to lose energy in prolonged maneuvering combat. But these individual advantages could not overcome the fundamental reality of the air war in 1944. The United States was producing Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and Lightnings faster than Germany could shoot them down. American pilot training programs were turning out thousands of competent aviators, while the Luftwaffe's training system had collapsed under the pressure of fuel shortages and relentless attrition. For every German ace who scored a victory against a P-47, there were 10 more Thunderbolts waiting to take its place. The skies over Europe had become a war of industrial attrition, and industrial attrition was a war that Nazi Germany could not win. The men who flew the Thunderbolt came from every corner of America. They were farm boys from Kansas and factory workers from Detroit. They were college students who had never been more than 50 miles from home, and immigrant sons who spoke Polish or Italian at the dinner table. What they shared was youth. Most were in their early 20s, and a willingness to climb into a machine that weighed as much as a truck and hurl themselves at an enemy who had been fighting air wars since Spain. Their training was intensive but brief. A pilot might have 200 hours in the air before being shipped overseas, and much of that time was spent in trainers that bore little resemblance to the Thunderbolt's power and complexity. They learned the rest in combat, if they lived long enough. The 56th Fighter Group, based at Boxted in Essex, became the most famous Thunderbolt unit in the 8th Air Force. Known as Zemke's Wolfpack, after its commanding officer, Colonel Hubert Zemke, the group produced more aces than any other fighter unit in the European theater. Zemke was a stern, demanding leader who drilled his pilots relentlessly in tactics and gunnery. He understood that individual skill mattered, but he also understood that air combat was a team sport, The wolf pack flew in disciplined formations, covered each other's blind spots, and attacked with coordinated aggression. Their kill-to-loss ratio was among the best in the entire Army Air Forces. Among Zemke's pilots were men who would become legends of the air war. Francis Gabreski, a Polish-American from Oil City, Pennsylvania, scored 28 aerial victories before being shot down and captured in July of 1944. He survived the war and later became an ace again in Korea, flying jets. Robert S. Johnson, whose miraculous survival after taking over 200 hits has already been described, finished the war with 27 confirmed kills. Walker Mahurin, known as Bud, scored 20 3/4 victories in Europe before being transferred to the Copteris Pacific, where he added another kill against the Japanese. These men were not supermen. They were ordinary Americans who had been taught to fly and to fight, and who had discovered within themselves a capacity for violence and endurance that peacetime life had never demanded. But for every ace, there were dozens of pilots who never scored a single victory. The air war was not a sport where individual statistics told the whole story. A pilot who flew 50 missions without ever firing his guns in anger had still contributed to the war effort. He had escorted bombers. He had absorbed the attention of German fighters. He had strafed targets and dropped bombs and kept the pressure on an enemy who could not afford to relax for a single day. Many of these anonymous pilots were killed by flak, by fighters, by mechanical failure, by simple bad luck. Their names are inscribed on memorials in Cambridge and Margraten and Manila, and most Americans have never heard of them. The Thunderbolts. Effectiveness as a ground attack aircraft reached its peak during the Normandy campaign and the subsequent breakout across France. Operation Cobra, the American offensive that finally broke the stalemate in the hedgerow country, was preceded by a massive aerial bombardment that included hundreds of fighter-bomber sorties. Thunderbolts and lightnings roamed ahead of the advancing columns, destroying anything that might slow the American advance. When the German army attempted to counterattack at Mortain in August of 1944, hoping to cut off Patton's breakout and restore their crumbling front, they ran straight into a wall of American air power. For 6 days, Thunderbolts and Typhoons, the British equivalent, pounded the German panzers relentlessly. The roads around Mortain became graveyards of burned-out tanks and trucks. German soldiers who survived the attacks described them as apocalyptic. One officer wrote in his diary that the fighter bombers came in waves, like a plague of locusts, and that there was nowhere to hide. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Falaise Pocket, which followed the failure at Mortain, became the graveyard of the German army in France. 200,000 German troops were encircled between the advancing American and British forces, and the only escape route was a narrow gap near the town of Falaise. As the Germans attempted to flee eastward, they were caught in the open by Allied aircraft. The Thunderbolts came in low, strafing the packed columns of men and vehicles. Pilots later described the scene as a turkey shoot, a grim phrase that captured both the one-sided nature of the slaughter and the dehumanizing effect of killing from the air. The roads through the pocket were choked with the wreckage of an entire army: tanks, trucks, ambulances, horse-drawn wagons, and the bodies of thousands of German soldiers. General Eisenhower visited the site after the battle and called it one of the greatest killing grounds of any of the war areas. Not all of these losses can be attributed to the P-47. The British Hawker Typhoon, armed with 4 20mm cannons and 8 rockets, was equally devastating in the ground attack role. Medium bombers and artillery also contributed to the carnage. But the Thunderbolt was central to the American effort, and its pilots flew themselves to exhaustion during those weeks. Some units flew 3 or 4 missions a day. Pilots developed a 1,000-yard stare that their ground crews recognized as the mark of men who had seen too much. They had entered the war as young men eager for adventure, and they emerged as killers efficient, professional, and haunted by what they had done. The German perspective on this air assault has been preserved in numerous memoirs and official reports. Luftwaffe pilots, who survived the summer of 19, 44 recalled the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Americans. Where once the German fighters had ruled the skies over France, now they were the hunted. A mission that began with 8 Focke-Wulfs might return with 3 or none. Replacement pilots arrived at the front with barely 100 hours of flight time, and they died within days. Fuel was so scarce that training flights were cancelled, which meant that new pilots went into combat without ever having fired their guns at a towed target. The spiral was vicious and inescapable. Untrained pilots died quickly, which meant more losses, which meant more untrained replacements, which meant still more losses. Yet even in this desperate situation, the Luftwaffe continued to resist. German pilots were not cowards, and many of them were ferociously motivated by ideology, patriotism, or simple pride. They knew by mid-1944 that the war was probably lost, but they fought anyway. Some hoped for a miracle, the promised Wunderwaffen, or wonder weapons, that Nazi propaganda claimed would turn the tide. Others simply refused to abandon their comrades or their country. A few, like the infamous Sonderkommando Elbe, volunteered for suicide ramming attacks against American bombers. The Luftwaffe's resistance was futile in strategic terms, but it was not insignificant. American bomber losses remained substantial throughout 1944 and into 1945. Every heavy bomber that went down took 10 trained crewmen with it. The air war over Germany was not a walkover. It was a bloody, grinding, attritional struggle in which both sides paid a terrible price. The Thunderbolt's final major campaign in Europe was the defense of the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944 and January of 1945. Hitler's last great offensive in the West was launched under cover of bad weather that grounded the Allied air forces for the first critical days. German panzers advanced through the fog and snow, achieving surprise and causing panic among the thinly stretched American units in their path. For nearly a week, the outcome of the battle hung in the balance. Then the weather cleared and the Thunderbolts returned. The effect was immediate and devastating. German armoured columns that had been advancing almost unopposed were suddenly caught in the open by swarms of fighter bombers. The P-47 groups flew maximum effort missions, sometimes launching before dawn and not returning until after dark. They attacked tanks, half-tracks, supply trucks, and artillery positions. They interrupted the roads and rail lines that the Germans needed to sustain their offensive. Within days, the momentum of the German advance had stalled. The panzers, already short of fuel, could not be resupplied. Units that had pushed deep into American territory found themselves cut off and surrounded. By mid-January, the Bulge had been eliminated, and the German army in the West had suffered losses from which it would never recover. One engagement from this period illustrates the nature of the air-ground battle. On December 23, 1944, the first clear day after the weather broke, P-47 seconds of the 362nd Fighter Group caught a German armoured column near the town of St. Vith. The column included tanks, half-tracks, and fuel trucks, exactly the kind of target the Thunderbolt had been designed to destroy. The pilots made repeated strafing passes, ignoring the flak that rose to meet them. By the time they were finished, the road was littered with burning vehicles. A German officer who survived the attack later wrote that the American pilots seemed to have no fear. They came in so low that he could see their faces. He had fought on the Eastern Front, where Soviet aircraft were a constant threat, but he had never seen anything like the precision and persistence of the American fighter bombers. The Thunderbolts, war in Europe, ended in May of 1945 with the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. By then, the P-47 had been partially supplanted by the P-51 Mustang in the long-range escort role. The Mustang, with its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and laminar flow wing, had greater range and better high-altitude performance than the Thunderbolt. It became the symbol of American air superiority in the final year of the war. But the Mustang could not match the Thunderbolt's effectiveness as a ground attack aircraft, and it could not absorb the same punishment. Pilots who flew both types often expressed a preference for the Jug. It was heavier, it was less elegant, but it brought them home. The statistics of the air war tell part of the story. P-47 pilots in the European theatre claimed nearly 4,000 air-to-air victories against Axis aircraft. They destroyed over 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 pieces of rolling stock, and more than 68,000 motor vehicles. They dropped over 132,000 tons of bombs and fired nearly 60 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. The losses were also substantial. Nearly 3,000 Thunderbolts were lost in combat or to operational accidents. That represented nearly half of all the P-47 seconds sent to Europe. Behind each of those numbers was a human being, an American pilot who did not come home, or a German soldier who died under the guns of an aircraft he had once mocked. But statistics cannot capture the human experience of the air war. They cannot convey the terror of a German infantryman who heard the rising roar of a Thunderbolt's engine and knew he had seconds to live. They cannot convey the exhilaration and the guilt of an American pilot who watched his tracers walk across a column of trucks and saw men tumbling from the cabs. They cannot convey the grief of a family in Ohio or Texas who received a telegram that began, "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret." The P-47 Thunderbolt was, in the end, a machine, a 7-ton assembly of aluminum, steel, and plexiglass, powered by an engine that burned 150 gallons of aviation fuel per hour. It had no feelings, no intentions, no moral compass. It did what its designers built it to do and what its pilots commanded it to do. But the men who flew it and the men who faced it were not machines. They were human beings caught up in the largest and most destructive conflict in human history. The story of the Thunderbolt is their story, a story of courage, skill, endurance, and the terrible mathematics of industrial warfare. Feldwebel Hans Dortenmann survived the war. He was credited with 18 aerial victories, most of them against American heavy bombers and their escorts. He was wounded several times and shot down more than once. After the war, he became a businessman and rarely spoke of his experiences. But in interviews conducted decades later, he remembered the Thunderbolt. He remembered the way it dove out of the sun, fast and relentless. He remembered the sound of its 8 machine guns a roar, he said, like tearing canvas. He remembered the day he saw what those guns could do to a FW-190, and he remembered thinking that the Americans had built something extraordinary. They had taken a design that looked like a joke and turned it into one of the most effective fighters of the war. The Jug was no joke. It was a killer. The Thunderbolt's legacy extended beyond the Second World War. It served in the early years of the Cold War with the newly established United States Air Force and with numerous foreign air forces, including those of France, Brazil, and the Republic of China. It saw combat again in the Greek Civil War, the First Indo-China War, and various Latin American conflicts. The last P-47 seconds were not retired from military service until the late 1960s, a remarkable lifespan for an aircraft designed in 1940. Today, only a handful of airworthy Thunderbolts survive, lovingly maintained by warbird enthusiasts and museums. They appear at air shows, their big radial engines bellowing, and spectators marvel at their size and their brutish beauty. But the true legacy of the Thunderbolt is not found in museums. It is found in the strategic lessons of the air war over Europe. The P-47 proved that a fighter aircraft could be both a capable air superiority platform and a devastating ground attack weapon. It proved that ruggedness and firepower could compensate for a lack of elegance. It proved that a well-trained pilot in a well-designed aircraft, supported by an overwhelming industrial base, could achieve dominance over an enemy who was brave, skilled, and fighting for his homeland. These lessons shaped American air doctrine for decades and influenced the design of subsequent fighters. From the F-84 Thunderjet to the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the modern Warthog that carries the Thunderbolt. Name and, not coincidentally, a massive 30mm cannon designed to destroy tanks. The men who flew the Thunderbolt are nearly all gone now. The youngest of them are in their late 90s, and each year there are fewer. Their war has passed from memory into history, from history into legend. But as long as the story is told, they are not forgotten. They were young once. They flew a big, ugly fighter that everyone underestimated. They went up against some of the best pilots in the world, and they won. Not because they were braver or more skilled, though many of them were both, but because they were part of something larger than themselves. They were the sharp edge of an industrial democracy that had decided, after much hesitation, to put its full weight into the fight. The P-47 Thunderbolt was the instrument of that decision. It was not elegant, it was not subtle, it was a blunt object, designed to smash and to endure, and it did both, magnificently. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.